to Tales from the Heart, a podcast from the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association. I am your host, Lisa Salberg, and I am joined today by Dr. Michael Ayers, and we're going to learn a little bit about him and their program. And our theme of the month is Medical Management May. Our subtopic is clinical trials. So it's a really important topic. It's a really important time of the year in so many ways. New data has just been released. The world of HCM and management is changing literally as we sit here and watch it. So it's pretty exciting to be in this time in HCM discovery. Dr. Michael Ayers, tell us a little bit about yourself. The audience hasn't met you yet on Tales from the Heart and why HCM is important to you.
Awesome. Happy to. Lisa, thank you very much for having me. I watch your Facebook streams. I'm still Facebook rather than the other platforms. My wife likes to tease me about that, but I watch your Facebook streams. I'm excited to be here. I grew up in rural Western North Carolina. So most people think an hour west of Asheville is Tennessee, but North Carolina is still hanging on there at the end of the state, and that's where I'm from. My dad ran a Bachelor of Fine Arts program, and my mom was a nurse. I went to undergraduate at University of Duke, and there I was actually a theater major, believe it or not. I don't know if you knew that about me, Lisa.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I graduated from Duke. I did all the pre-med stuff and theater and spent 3 years doing musicals. And so I actually did a couple national tours. Two funny theater stories. I'll tell you both. Okay. I was doing a pre-Broadway run of a show when the market collapsed in 2010, and we were like a month from opening, and the show was great. It had Jeff Daniels in it. You know Jeff Daniels?
Of course.
Like Dumb and Dumber. Yeah. And I was like, man, I don't think I have the temperament for this kind of fluctuating employment, or what actors often call fun employment when you become unemployed. And so that was one of the big things that kind of pushed me back towards medical school. Jeff Daniels actually wrote my letter of recommendation for medical school, funny enough. And literally all everyone wanted to talk about on my interviews
was Jeff Daniels.
Was Jeff Daniels. So I had like the easiest round of medical school interviews possible because people were just like, yeah, does he like Dumb and Dumber? Do people tell him that they like that movie? What's his favorite movie? And I'd be like, I am happy to talk about
I'd like to be a doctor.
Yeah.
That is so funny. I did not know that.
Yeah. And so if you flash back to the beginning of my story, my dad ran a Bachelor of Fine Arts program and my mom was a nurse. I am truly not far from the tree. So then I went to Columbia for medical school, and that's where I met my wife. We actually met on the orientation cruise. I tell my patients she is the smarter and more likable and more charming Dr. Ayers, all of which is true. And I'll tell you, residents all kind of roll their eyes and go, yeah. And then they meet her and they're like, oh, wow. Yeah, she's great. And I'm like, yeah, I told you. Then I trained at University of Pennsylvania, and that's where I first kind of fell in love with HCM. I remember being on service with Anjali Owens and getting an HCM patient starting disopyramide as an intern, and me saying, I don't know this medicine. And she said, you will. And so I did both residency and fellowship at Penn. And then I kind of created a super fellowship my last year where I spent 6 months with Charlene Day and Anjali Owens in clinic. And it was sort of all HCM all the time. Anjali's clinic has a little more variability with inherited cardiomyopathies and other heart failure stuff, but spent a lot of time with them. And then my wife and I started interviewing for jobs, and she sees aggressive lymphomas, and she's really kind of subspecialized in that. And we were both interviewing, and when we came down to University of Virginia, Chris Kramer had just taken the chief job, and he was like, well, I'm going to be giving up a lot of my HCM volume because I'm going to be division chief. So we're looking for someone to do HCM. And a guy who discovered one of the aggressive lymphoma types, Dr. Williams here, was also stepping away clinically, both at the same time. And this was in January of 2020, pre-COVID, like right on the cusp of COVID. And we had no connection to the University of Virginia at all. And we said, oh my gosh, this is great. And then we signed and got our first place to live. And then COVID hit about 2 weeks later. And then we started in the middle of the pandemic.
What kind of unfortunate timing.
Yeah.
To move to a new place and try to start your clinical work and your social life.
It was real tough. People would always say, "How do you like Charlottesville?" And Emily and I would go, "We don't really know.
We haven't seen it. We've been here a year.
We don't know." And so we moved here. When we moved here, we had 2 boys at the time, and now we have 2 boys and a girl. And we're doing great in Charlottesville. Here, I was made the co-director of the HCM clinic about 3 years ago. And then Chris is going to be stepping down as co-director as he takes on ACC presidency, which will be a year from now. Pretty big job, I hear.
Yes.
And so I'll be the director upcoming in the fall. And since I've got here, we've been very excited about how things have gone. I was very fortunate to have Anjali and Charlene as mentors because they sort of wrote a list of things. They were like, there is an HCM center at UVA already, but if you want to start an HCM practice, here's a checklist for you. And things like develop an in-house registry, make sure you've got your hand in trials in all of the different areas and different therapies. Have a dedicated genetic counselor who's in clinic with you. Have a dedicated pharmacist who's in clinic with you. Have a dedicated nurse who's in clinic with you. As soon as you can, get a nurse practitioner that's going to help you see expedited follow-ups when needed. And so they kind of handed me a lot of these things, and I asked for them in my first contract, and Chris Kramer said, "Sounds great." He's a very supportive boss. And so our HCM clinic, since we've got here, has grown almost 100% from its volume before. We're now at a little over 1,000 patients. I just crossed the 800 patient threshold, which you told me 4 years ago. You're going to start seeing some non-HCM when you get to 600 to 800, Michael. And you were absolutely right. And so that's been happening. And so our inherited heart center is actually starting to grow, really with HCM as the linchpin. That's me. I talked for so long.
I like it though.
Yeah.
You're the theater. See, I didn't know the theater part. That makes so much sense to me.
It clicks, huh?
It makes sense because there's this difference, and every doctor, every person has their own personality and what have you. But your communication style, now that I understand the theater, I understand your communication style, which I think really helps because not a lot of physicians are really great communicators. Sometimes they're very cerebral, but how they're communicating with others sometimes doesn't come across so smoothly. So I think you've got that.
That's very insightful of you to say. I appreciate the compliment. I mean, we all have things we can work on, and I'm sure I can work on communication amongst other things. But 2 things. One, when I was applying for residency and fellowship, I did get a question a lot, how has your theater helped you? And in theater, if you study theater theory, good theater is all about maximizing conflict between 2 people. And figuring out how 2 people can have objectives in opposite directions. That's what makes kind of interesting moments. In doctoring, you actually want to do the opposite. You want to figure out what the other person's priorities are, and then see how much you can swing your priorities over to safely align with them. And so in something like HCM, I often wonder if I sort of migrated towards that because there's so much shared decision making, and you get to kind of figure out what your patient's priorities are and then minimize conflict by lining up with them as safely and best as you can.
I think we need to teach masterclass on that. We need to help the other centers understand that unique point of view because I think it's really helpful. And the cool part about our community is we all come from slightly different backgrounds. And I think we can all learn from the strengths that others have. And I think that's a really interesting point of view. We'll bring Jeff Daniels in and you can practice on him. He could be the patient because that'll get everybody to sign up for the program. And we'll say, okay, Mr. Daniels, you're going to be playing a patient with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Here are the symptoms. Here's the life experience. I actually just watched an interview with him the other day. I think he's fabulous.
He is the most normal person ever. You would never know he was a movie star. He's great. But we might hurt Tom Hanks's feelings if we skip over to Jeff.
Well, Tom played an HCM patient and he played it very well. Otto, we bow to you. But, you got the Jeff connection. So we might.
That's right. We'll play that
back on that one. We might circle back on that one. Okay. So great to understand a little bit more about Michael Ayers as a person and as an actor. But now we're going to talk about where we are in HCM. So you had an amazing upbringing in HCM. And, I love the roots of your parents, how they both connected with your life story. But to have Charlene and Anjali as some of your early mentors in HCM, you've got powerhouse.
Yeah.
And you go down to Chris, who For those who don't know, Chris Kramer organized the HCMR registry. So that was the MRI registry. We helped recruit I think 2,400 patients for that particular trial. And we touched on this quickly. Chris is currently the co-director of the program. He will be handing off to Michael to be the director. I don't know if he's going to be getting a co or not, but he will be the president of the American College of Cardiology next year. So he's the incoming president. So there's a whole workflow that he has to do on that. Plus he's administrative for the hospital. And it's good to have friends with good titles because we can cut through a lot of nonsense and get the work done. Chris is not going to be lost to the HCM community, but he will be focusing on other priorities. So that is an amazing background. And you've got 1,000 patients now, which I'm not surprised at. And I think you're going to grow a bit more, especially after people get to know you a little bit more. But I think the people of your state are well served. And we have to make sure that we're getting that hub and spoke focus to come back into you. Medical management may. You mentioned disopyramide earlier. And we've come a long way since DISO. We continue to evolve, yet DISO remains on the playlist. Let's just take a breakdown of somebody comes to you with HCM. What are the normal meds we see? What do we know about them? And where are we going with medical management?
So when I see a new patient, I'm really striving to understand what their individual symptomatology is, what their list of symptoms are. And I work very hard in communicating with their families to get a really good sense of how they're doing. But I'll be honest, I picked this up from Charlene. I have a very low threshold to get concomitant objective information about how they're doing. And so I stress basically anybody who can make it through a treadmill. And so unless you have orthopedic issues that are prohibiting you from walking briskly on a treadmill, I'm stressing you. And sometimes that confuses patients, particularly patients who have minimal symptoms. But the reason I'm doing that is twofold. One of the most important treatment splits, as this audience knows, is figuring out if you're obstructive or non-obstructive. And we often use Valsalva to get the half of patients who have obstruction that require provocation. But people don't Valsalva very well, and we don't image it very well. To do a really good Valsalva, you've got to have a strong bearing down for 10 to 12 seconds. And when you think about some of the people coming in, that's really tough for them. And so if we're using Valsalva to catch half the people with obstruction, we're going to miss. So I exercise all these people, Lisa, and I do it because I want to make sure I'm treating the non-obstructives as non-obstruction and the obstructives as obstructive.
Correct.
But I'm also getting a sense of what their exercise capabilities are. I know you know this study from Malin, but for those of you who don't, Cleveland did a great study where they took all their class 1, meaning I don't have symptoms, I say I have no symptoms, class 1 obstructive patients, and they put them on a treadmill. 17% of those patients could do an average exercise for their age and gender, which means it's really hard to have asymptomatic obstruction. And when you live with the disease for decades, you don't always know that you have trouble doing things that other people can do. You just don't know. And so when I'm seeing a new patient, I'm very interested in the obstructive, non-obstructive piece because it's going to drive my therapy. I'm using exercise to make sure I'm not missing occult obstruction that's only evident when you exercise or push them. But I'm also using stress to make sure you and I are on the same page about your symptoms. I believe you, but I want to see it. I'll tell you though, Lisa, spousal signs, a very powerful thing in HCM. Spousal signs where I say, how many flights of stairs can you do? And you go 2, and your spouse goes, you don't take the stairs. And you go, okay.
Family input, I think, is critically important. Even like your teenage or young adult children. No, Mom, you've been slow the whole time. You know, we go to an amusement park, you're slow. We do this, we're slow. We can't do stairs. So getting input, best friend input, spouse input, family input, could not agree with you more. We don't know what normal is.
Right.
We don't know. I was trying to explain this recently to somebody who we ask them what symptoms they have when they do an intake with us. Okay. So they're like, I'm short of breath. I get palpitations. But then when we ask New York Heart Association class, you're like, I'm fine. I'm 1. I'm like, okay, so help me understand how you feel these things and you think it's not limiting you. Well, I'm just used to it. That doesn't exactly match. So when you start asking them very pointed questions and ask that spousal input or family input, we start to realize that we have normalized a lot of unnormal behaviors. And we're just used to having a more difficult time breathing and walking or breathing and talking. And when we have that okay moment where we allow ourselves to understand our symptoms and that this may not be normal, there's a rough switch on somebody when that happens. There's this, oh, wait, there might really be something wrong with me. And that first 2 years of diagnosis and realization that normal's not normal is really hard on people. I love that you're stressing them. I love that you're getting objective data, because we're not good historians, because we've just been kind of in the classification of suck it up, buttercup. And that's how we live, because it's all we got. What do we do for these people? Once we figure out whether they're obstructed or not obstructed, what pills do we pull from the toolbox?
So we'll start with obstruction, because I think that's a more straightforward of the two. I am still starting with the same thing that ESC and now the new American guidelines recommend. I'm offering beta blocker and calcium channel block up front. I'll be quite frank with you, when there's rip-roaring obstruction, I'm probably leading patients a little bit with, Lisa, I don't think this is going to work for you, but let's try it for a couple weeks. And I'm being upfront with that. But if you've got really mild obstruction, I do have a handful of patients that I think are getting enough improvement that that's a good option. So I'm starting beta blocker and calcium channel blocker. But I'm having a low threshold to re-stress those people to see, because we're part of a couple European registries right now, large databases for stress testing. And what we're seeing is, even in people who are having symptomatic improvement or reports of symptomatic improvements, when we stress them, their exercise tolerance actually isn't getting any better. They might be feeling a little better when they start to do a higher workload. So what they're experiencing is better, but what they're capable of doing is still reduced relative to people their age and gender. And so I'm having a very low threshold now to extend to what I consider the next lines of therapy. What are those next lines? Well, right now, I don't have data to tell you this is the second line. So what I'm doing is I'm offering 5 things in concert. And I will tell you, I am repeatedly struck by how unable I am to predict what people are going to do when I offer them those 5 lines of therapy. So what are they? Disopyramide. And disopyramide is a really not a bad option, especially if you have early onset atrial fibrillation. So if you've got early onset AFib, it's still a reasonable option. I'll tell you, I only probably have 8 patients on diso, but early onset AFib, you're going to get some AFib control. You're going to get a little bit less of those central side effects that you get with beta blocker, increased appetite, decreased energy, decreased sex drive, things none of my patients like to have. But it's a good drug for a select few. I'm offering on-label cardiac myosin inhibitor, which right now is just mavacamten. And a lot of patients now are coming to that, whereas the first time meeting me, drug was just out. They were like, I don't want to be experimented on. But now they're hearing and seeing results, and I'm having a lot more people choose CMI up front. I think we just crossed maybe our 80th person on drug at the center. I'm offering alcohol septal ablation. I'm discouraging generally younger people from doing alcohol septal ablation, but if you're really 45, 50 plus, I'm offering that option. And we have a really good alcohol septal ablation program. And most importantly, Lisa, I trust the person who's evaluating them. And if he tells me we're going to get a good result, we're going to get a good result, right? It's like when Nadu tells you we're going to get a good result, you go, okay.
Yep.
I'm offering myectomy. I will tell you overall, younger people are still migrating towards myectomy. And it's a surgery that we know is going to last 10, 20 years with 95% success. And so I'm offering myectomy, and a lot of younger patients are saying, let's do that. A lot of middle to older age patients that have another cardiac problem, like a valve problem, are also choosing that. I'm also offering clinical trial. And so everybody gets offered the clinical trials that are available. Right now, that's just going to be Edgewise's compound, because Cytokinetics and BMS have both closed their CMI arm. There is SGLT2 inhibitor. So for those of you who don't know Edgewise's compound, it's mavacamten, aficamten analog, meaning it's a very similar drug. They want to describe it as differently, which is fine, but it's a very similar drug. Their animal model data is showing less reducing of ejection fraction. And so so this audience knows this, but about 4 to 8% of people on cardiac myosin inhibitor will see their ejection fraction, how much blood is pumped out with each beat, drop below 50. And this compound is purported, again, early data, to do that less. There's also a trial for SGLT2 inhibitors that will allow obstructive patients to come in. That trial is being run by Lexicon. I think it was named 2 days ago. It's Sonata. I think it just got a name. So there's an SGLT2 trial. I'm not sure how that's going to work for obstruction, but obstructive patients are included in the trial. And so I mentioned that as well. And then there's gene therapy trials. And so I offer all of those things up front. And
are you a site for gene therapy at this time?
Yeah, great question. So we are very excited. We are the central site right now for BioMarin's gene therapy trial for ADV9. So that's an adenovector. So it's a big virus shell. It doesn't have the virus. It's just the shell. And that shell gets directed to heart tissue. And inside that shell is the whole MYBPC3 mutation. So if you're an MYBPC3 positive patient, this drug, in theory, would replace your gene, which has loss of function. We're a candidate for that. Tenaya is going to try and run an MYH7 trial, the second most common mutation. That trial, as far as I can tell, hasn't started engaging with sites yet. That's a little bit of a harder drug to design, and so we'll see. But big picture, let's take a step back and review that. You start with beta blocker and calcium channel blocker, but I'm telling you, low threshold to tell me if this isn't working. I'm offering disopyramide, particularly if you have early onset AFib. I'm offering mavacamten, the only available cardiac myosin inhibitor right now. I'm offering alcohol septal ablation. I'm encouraging of more 55, 60 and older. I'm a little discouraging of younger than that, but I'm still offering to everyone. I'm offering myectomy. That's where you go in with, the knife, you cut it out. That I'm encouraging people to consider if they've got another condition that needs to be addressed, like severe mitral regurgitation, a valve that doesn't work. And I'm offering clinical trial. And I'm offering all 5 things. And I, again, am very struck when I have this very conversation in my first meeting, how unable I am to predict exactly what fits your ethics, your situation, your ethos, your goals. I have people who come to me with like mavacamten t-shirts on that leave going, I think I want an alcohol septal ablation. Like it's hard when you get all the information to predict what people are going to do.
I think that's an excellent point, that we think that we're making it easier to treat patients. Reality is it's not easier. It's more complicated because there's more in the equation. But when you sit as the patient and learn about all of your options, and you sit as the physician and you learn about the patient and what's going on in their life right now, there's a lot of different things that can impact what choice is right for what person at what time. If you have a woman of childbearing years who wants to have a child, myosin inhibitor currently available probably isn't a good choice for them. And if they want to have a pregnancy and they're obstructed, let's do surgery. Let's get you healed from the surgery. Then let's talk about pregnancy. So that makes sense for that age group, that demographic. 60-year-old person with a little bit of obstruction, alcohol ablation might be just what they need.
Right.
And you have to really look at the person. And a lot of people are looking at the finances. Mm-hmm. So, okay, if I do the surgery, it's kind of a one and done. And yeah, I might still be on a little something afterwards, but I have good insurance this year. I've hit my numbers. This is what it's going to cost me. This is how much time I'm going to be out of work. This works for me now. In 10, 15, 20 years, something might come up. In 5 years, something might come up. But I think if we are honest with ourselves, we change over time. Our decisions change. Our opinions on therapies change. I'll take it a little personal for a second. About like 8, 9 years ago, when the leadless pacemakers came out, I remember walking across from my old office and going to the sushi place, and one of the Medtronic reps was there. And I'm like, hey, how you doing? He's like, great. Have you seen this new thing? And he shows me this new little bullet-shaped thing. And I'm like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. I'm like, why would anybody put that in their heart? That is stupid. I thought it was a really bad idea from my perspective at that time.
Yeah.
Well, let's flash forward a few years. My heart goes into intermittent heart block, my transplanted heart, and I need technology. I need a pacemaker. I can't put one in the top because, like 20 some odd years of a device and lots of scar and whatever. And then I look at this leadless pacemaker. I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. So I went from it being the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of to, yes, I'd like one, please. And that's an evolution of 10 years. At the time, I thought of it in a heart forever at 30 something or 40 something. It was a different story than at 55 being a transplanted heart and not wanting the rest of the risks. This is not an option for most HCM patients, the leadless pacemakers, but I need a new technology. My position changed. My point of view changed. My needs changed. And as an HCM patient evolves, technology evolves, their needs change, and we have to play this dance. We're doing this for life. This is not a one and done. Even if you have a myectomy, it's not one and done. You're coming back.
Right.
So what are you coming back for? And then we have to treat that. So I encourage patients to stay open-minded in terms of options. And even if they looked at something 5 years ago and they said, no, that's not for me, come back. Come back and let's talk about it again. Because the world's changed in 5 years. You've changed in 5 years. I think we all need to continue to evolve and learn and grow as a community.
And it doesn't have to be either or, which is exactly what you're saying, right? It can be yes and. I have plenty of patients that are going to need something in the cath lab anyway, and we say, let's do this alcohol ablation. And if it doesn't work, I can mop up some of this gradient with a CMI. Similarly, if you choose CMI and a year from now, you feel great without obstruction, but the medicine truly is interfering with your quality of life in terms of number of echoes needed, or in terms of cost, or in terms of I don't just want to take meds. I don't want to take meds anymore. Any of those things, we can pivot. You don't have to be set in one pathway. This is a journey we're doing together. It's not either or, it's yes and often.
The yes and, I think, is a great way to put it. We have a lot of people who are yes ands. We have a lot of them. And I've worked with many, many, many over years where they started over here, they land over there, and they bounce around. We need to continue the conversation. I think if you have not had a conversation with your HCM specialist in the past 18 months to 2 years, get on the calendar, go in and reboot, really look at everything, be objective. Don't say I'm fine. Prove you're fine. Get the data, get the objective data. I think that's the most important message that we could get out there today to the patients. The good and the bad news is the patients who are existing right now that we know about, they're getting the options of this great management strategy. They're the beneficiaries of what we've been building for, 30 years. Problem is the undiagnosed. Now, that's a whole jump down a rabbit hole that I could spend like a month in, but we have to find the undiagnosed. That's really, really, really becoming more and more evident that there's a lot of suffering going on out there. There's a lot of wasted healthcare dollars on people who are getting the wrong therapies because they don't have the right diagnosis. So we need to get them into the fold. These thick hearts, I just kind of have taken a different view of HCM lately and looked at it as all thick hearts, as you mentioned earlier. When you get your program big enough and the referrals are coming in because people see thick hearts and they make the referral, some of them aren't HCM. Some of them are just HFpEF, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Some of them are amyloid. Some of them are sarcoid. Some of them are Fabry's. There's all kinds of different things that could be thick hearts. And we got to treat the right thing at the right time with all of the tools in the toolbox.
Yeah, I will tell you, I am struck by how often good cardiologists, myself included, have misdiagnosed someone because they just didn't go all the way through getting all the data. The number of patients I get referred who never had an MRI to confirm this isn't amyloid. This isn't protein deposited in your heart muscle. This is HCM. You know this data that we published, 1 in 8 referrals from cardiologists to our center with a diagnosis of HCM have something else. And sometimes it's a completely different treatment paradigm, not just for them, but the screening for their family. You'll chuckle at this one. I had a guy coming in telling me my brother had idiopathic hypertrophic subaortic stenosis. So it's been going on that long in their family. And I have new shortness of breath. My doctor said I had HCM. He was 78, 80, MRI. He had amyloid.
Wow.
Right? So just because it's even in your family, you've got to get the objective data to show that it is what we think it is. And that person, completely different treatment, right? That person's on tafamidis, totally different medicine. That patient's family, different set of screening algorithm. anyway, it's just you got to get the data.
Excellent points. As we're talking about medical management, one of the first things we go through in our newly diagnosed groups, which if you are newly diagnosed, you can sign up once a week with Linda for a newly diagnosed group that kind of gives you some education and gets you ready to explore why your heart is thick. If it is amyloid, like you just said, there is a completely different mechanism of disease. It looks very similar on imaging, but it acts very differently long-term, and you got to get the right drugs in there. And if you miss that opportunity, these people do not live long lives without therapy. So we have to get in there with the right treatment. You're going to hear some new terminology coming from us that HCMA is the home of the big-hearted. And it's not just hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Yes, that's the core of where most of our work will be, but these HFpEF people, these amyloid, these Fabres, the kids with the restopathies, they all have thick hearts, but they're different. So we want to make sure every thick heart gets the right medicine, and every thick heart gets the right evaluation, and every thick-hearted family gets the right evaluation. We got a lot to do.
It's such a confusing thing to try explain to the cardiology community, though, right? Because what I just told you is you got to get all the data. 1 in 8 patients don't have HCM. But at the same time, I'm sure you know Anjali's data out of Penn. Most patients with HCM saw 3 cardiologists over a period of 4 to 8 years before getting their diagnosis. When you look at autopsy data, 1 in 300 people have HCM. ICD-10, which is how doctors code what people have, 1 in 3,000 do. That would suggest we're getting 90% of these people left in the community. We're diagnosing at a rate of 10%. This makes me even sadder. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but when you look at our rates of family testing, do you know what our genetic testing rate is outside of centers of excellence? 3 to 5%.
And they're often done in the wrong person.
And they're not even done in the prodrome. That's right.
Somebody says, oh, my sister has HCM, and some doctor who just heard something about genetic testing said, oh, let's see if you have the gene for it. Oh, honey, it doesn't work that way. Proband first. The first person identified with HCM, true clinical HCM, we genetically test that person.
Right.
If that person has an identified gene, then we can use it on sister, not the other way around. I had one pediatric cardiologist, I won't even say what state or town, telling this family, well, your son died, and if your daughter doesn't carry one of the known genes, then I'm going to let them play sports, and I'm going to let them go. This is like 10, 15 years ago. I'm going to go let them live their life and do whatever they need to do. It doesn't work that way. And we can't let misinformation lead the day.
Right.
And it's a constant battle to stay in front of some of the stuff that's out there. The timing of Camzyos launch post-COVID. Oh my, some of the conspiracy theorists that came after me because, HCM is just from COVID, but COVID wasn't real, but HCM is only here because COVID was here. I'm like, you guys are talking out of both sides of your mouth now. I don't even understand where you're trying to come from.
At least pick one conspiracy. Yeah.
Pick a conspiracy. Do not try to conjoin the conspiracies. So they thought because the drug for the disease was launched after COVID that somehow all of this comes from COVID. And there was even news announcers. I won't even mention what networks, but you might be able to figure it out, claiming that all the sudden deaths that had happened after COVID were related to the vaccine, when we know the number of sudden cardiac arrest in undiagnosed individuals has existed at a pretty steady number for 20 years. And they were taking these young kids who had died, and they're claiming that the vaccine had something to do with their deaths and destroying these families. Misinformation is almost as deadly as not diagnosis. No diagnosis. So we need to make sure that we're staying out in front of fact and science and truth as much as we possibly can. It's tough sometimes, though. I'm sure I'm going to get some crap on this podcast too.
But it's why the HCMA is so important ultimately, because we want patients to be motivated in understanding their own disease courses. But that doesn't mean that everything that Dr. Google told you on your first pass was true. So we need to encourage patients to learn about their diseases, but also send them to reliable information sources, which is where you've made such a major impact. I hope people say thank you enough to you, because thank you as an HCM treater for all you do. When your patients come in, man, I'm not starting at ground zero. I'm starting with very detailed, intelligent questions and people that are highly motivated in understanding their illness, who aren't listening to Dr. Google. They're listening to Dr. Lisa.
No, Dr. Lisa, Advocate Lisa. I wouldn't want your job for nothing. Respect the hell out of what you do, but I'm glad that I get to watch from this side of the fence. Because sometimes I'm like, oh, well, here you go, Michael, have this patient.
That's right.
This one's going to be complicated. I think what we have built and what we have done as a community, I'm my own hardest critic. It's just the way I operate, always have. But I have been able to look back a little bit now and go, whoa, we actually did something here. We actually changed the world for the better in a tiny little place called the HCM community. And we've brought clinicians and medical institutions and pharmaceutical companies and device companies and patients together to have an intelligent conversation where we all can speak a similar language and understand each other's points of view at the deepest level possible. And this goes up to the regulators. This is, working with the FDA on our PFDD. This is going to Lisbon, Portugal to see new data being presented from our friends over at Cytokinetics. That was, I wish you were there. It was awesome. There's a lot of discovery in HCM. And this is where I'm just going to couch my statement with, we all have our day in the sun and we've all had successes. The myocardia team had some early successes. Then BMS bought the myocardia properties and IP. They had their day in the sun. They had their ACC moment where Melinda Tsai gets up in the late breaking trials and says, ta-da. And I was in the fifth row for that one. I was in the third row for Cytokinetics. And to hear data hitting not only the primary endpoint, but 10 secondary endpoints, that doesn't happen often. The data is clean. And my hat's off to the entire team at Cyto for a really clean trial, great data, another option for patients.
Absolutely.
Coming.
The more drugs of a class that are available, the better it is for patients. Sometimes it gets more complicated for the provider because you're having to cycle through insurance approvals and who's made a deal with what and all those things. And that's frustrating for patients as well when you leave the office and I say, we're starting aficamten. And 2 weeks later, you get a message from me saying, never mind, we're starting mavacamten. But ultimately, more drugs in a class is good for patients. Some of the problems and some of the issues that HCMA will be working on over the next couple of months, years, this is going to take a long haul. We know PBM reform is needed. So pharmacy benefit managers are the ones who really dictate who has access to what drug, what's on formulary. Right. And you can't figure that out in advance unless you've got some serious, deep understanding of healthcare. It's complicated. The pre-authorizations, the waiting on phones, the peer-to-peer reviews, all the, excuse the very Jersey girl expression here, all the bullshit behind healthcare needs to go away. Personal rant. Not regular healthcare, but so for those of you who were with me and Stacy in Cincinnati a couple of weeks ago, on the way home from Cincinnati in the airport, a wheelchair operator ran into the back of my heel at full force. I got a boo-boo on my foot. It made my plantar fasciitis act up. So I have to go to a doctor, but it happened while I was at work. So now I have to go through workman's comp. I've had to speak to 4 different individuals to set up an appointment with a doctor. I go to the doctor, I get a prescription. I've had to talk to 4 or 5 different individuals now to set up physical therapy on my foot. This is an utter waste of time. Yes, you got to be careful. Yes, people do bad things and they claim that they got hurt when they didn't. But we're wasting healthcare time. We're making it more cumbersome for people to be able to access care. We're supposed to be making it easier. Big data is supposed to make it easier. Technology is supposed to make it easier. Why are we all getting into systems that they're making it harder and harder and harder and harder? We need to change the system. This is not working. It's not sustainable. We're going to have to make the world we want to live in. Did you know for every 1 patient-facing healthcare worker, there are 10 administrators in the U.S.? Unfortunately, I am aware of that statistic. I understand it's complicated, but it takes a PhD to try and navigate what your insurance covers. And that's just not a fair thing to do to patients. Because these literally are your lives, right? We talk about health literacy. We try to educate people on how to use their programs, but then the programs keep shifting and changing. And they find these, little cracks in the facade that they break open and they're like, oh, well, we found a pathway through. So my new most hated thing is alternative funding pathways. Have you heard of this one? No, lay it on me. Oh, it's great.
sarcasm. I'm a Gen X. We use a lot of sarcasm. Your health plan sets up, they encourage you as the employer or person who's purchasing the healthcare plan to, quote, evaluate the health needs of your community, which under ACA, you're not supposed to evaluate the medical conditions of your staff and use that for any purpose to decide what coverage they get or don't get. So there's a disconnect between ACA and alternative funding strategies. The alternative funding strategy is look for those high dollar medicines and take them off your formulary and offer instead an alternative funding mechanism. Doesn't that sound very fancy?
Makes it sound a little nicer than I suspect it's going to be when you finish describing it.
Honey, it's evil. It's just evil. So instead of getting your prescription, it go for pre-authorization and they say yes or no, they say no, and then they tell you to go to an alternative funding mechanism. Alternative funding mechanism. So as you know, many pharmaceutical companies, when they put a product on market, they offer patient assistance programs. Makes sense. How do they work? Well, there's copays and deductibles that they cover on behalf of the patient. The insurance company pays the rest. Well, the insurance companies either want that money for themselves, so they take that and they don't count it towards your, so those are called copay accumulators, and they don't actually count towards your copays and deductibles because somebody else paid it, which shouldn't matter. So that's one thing. But in alternative funding, they say, well, go to the company and see if they'll pay for it. Well, they'll only pay if you have insurance because the insurance is taking most of the fee. So they say no. So then they tell them to come to nonprofit organizations and see if we have money to pay for it. That's the insurance plan. Go see if somebody else will pay for it. And then if they won't, well, then you can make a one-off decision whether you'll cover it or you won't cover it. But it's not written in the policy. It would be a policy exclusion. So in other words, pass the buck to somebody else because we don't really want to pay for your medicine. Is that really the way we should be practicing medicine in the United States in 2024? But it's snuck through and it's legal. And I don't care what party politics you belong to. The system doesn't work for anybody. If you are a middle earner in America, which middle is where most of them are, you can't afford healthcare if the policies are not set up properly. We need better healthcare reform. Yeah. We need to really think about how we're practicing medicine, and we need to make sure patients can get the care that they need. We've spent a lot of time developing these drugs. Targeted therapies are the way to go. We really need to do more work to make sure people can get access. That's my soapbox for this Friday.
Oh,
I know. Isn't it horrible?
Well, we're lucky to have people like you on our side. We're working on it, but man, that seems, evil.
It is evil. I have tried to come up with a better word. I cannot come up with one because the scheme is evil. It's to save money for businesses. And hey, I'm an employer too, right?
Yeah.
And I was a health plan administrator for 18 years before I started this work. I know how policies are written and I know what we really need to do. And your 1-to-10 ratio is 100% dead on. We have too much paperwork and not enough people work.
I love that saying. I'm going to write that down.
Lisa said, not enough people work. Not enough people work. And we need to focus on people. And that is one of the things I'm so happy that our HCMA recognized centers of excellence can provide. You know, we come in and we say, hey, here's what you need to build. I can remember flying into Charlotte. It was Charlottesville. It was a tiny little airport you had there. And I remember landing, this is like a while back. And I'm like, oh, I'll just get a cab.
Uh-oh.
There was one in the town at that time.
That's like, George, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
The one cab guy.
Yeah, the one cab guy. And like they had to call him from the airport and they're like, we actually have somebody here for you. And I remember like landing in the cow field and like, where am I going? And thinking back then of setting this up, and Chris is like, it'll grow. I'll find the right person. And I think he did. Taken a long time, but we've grown up and you're providing care to so many people. What do you think is coming next to therapies for those with HCM? Where do you think we're going to go next?
We talked about in the obstructive group, there's going to be other cardiac myosin inhibitors or modifiers is what they might call them, things that change the way that the muscle cell comes together, which is the way that mavacamten and aficamten works. It's the way that Edgewise's compound works. We know SGLT2s, which were developed as a diabetes drug, found enormous success in cardiac diseases, are going to make their run at HCM. I will be honest with you, it does not fully make sense to me, the mechanism by which this will work, but it has worked in so many disease states. I am reluctant to vote against it, or bet against it, rather.
Let me hypothesize with you for a moment, because I've been thinking about this as well. If you go back to some early data from like what Charlene did when she was in Michigan, and we were doing the pre-work for the RESET trial, and we found that most patients with HCM were 1 or 2 points higher on their BMI than their matched equivalents, so age-matched equivalents. Not HCM. And if you talk to patients with HCM, there are certain foods that make us feel bad, other foods that make us feel better. We do better on a Mediterranean diet. It's hard to do all the time for some people based on where they live, but carbs are the enemy. I've been thinking a lot, not only on the SGLT1, SGLT2s, but the new Imbria drug. We're talking about energetics. We're talking about where the body is driving energy from. And when we're giving it a cheap source of energy, carbs, we don't feel as well. If these SGLT1, SGLT2s are helping regulate the sugar in our body and not giving the heart the cheap energy to work off of, which doesn't seem like it's working very well. It's like cheap gas versus high test. I think there's something in that mechanism that's impacting cardiac function. This is my philosophy and hypothesis. I don't know if it's going to work out or not. I'm not a chemist, but it makes sense to me that by regulating where you're pulling energy from, it might improve how you feel.
I think you are probably right. There's something to that. There's a few proposed mechanisms, and I haven't talked to Charlene at depth about this particular drug trial, but what I'll tell you is we initially thought SGLT1 and 2 were 2 transporters that only existed in the gut and the kidney. But what we've found is that blood vessels and probably heart muscle also have these SGLT1 and 2 in them. We don't really understand the role completely of what they're doing there, but we know when we do proteomic assays, so when we look at what proteins are actually being produced by the cell, heart muscle is changing its metabolic profile when you start these medications in a way that we couldn't fully have predicted and don't completely understand, but that seems to be more energetically favorable. And so we think that it's an off-target effect of the diabetes drug, not necessarily management of diabetes. So now we've got, for one thing, we know having better blood sugar is good. And so it's going to treat that. It results in about 5 to 10 pounds of weight loss, which we know is good in HCM. And so we've got that going. And then we've got this off-target effect where it's changing how things are metabolized in heart muscle in a way that I don't fully understand. I'm sure Charlene's much closer to understanding it than I am. And we've got this third mechanism. And so what we're hopeful is that all of these together are going to result in a positive result. I will tell you, while I think it might be successful in obstructive, I'm more hopeful in the non-obstructive cohort because I feel like that is a section that, just like you and I did, we're like so excited about talking about obstruction. The non-obstructive, we're still struggling to figure out and treat. And so I'm hopeful that SGLT2s, SGLT1/2s are going to be successful in that group. We talked about obstruction and we talked about the cardiac myosin, other allosteric inhibitors that are in the pipeline. We talked about SGLT1/2s. We touched on gene therapy. You could easily spend an hour on the gene therapy.
Yes.
Are you going to have a session dedicated to that later, most likely?
We have done a number of sessions on the evolving technology of gene therapy. We've even held some focus groups. And the first thing we did in the focus group is after we give them some education, we say, okay, number one, do you think this is needed in HCM? Every single person that participated in our focus group said, yeah, we need to do this. We need to go there. And I know it's a little bit, it's a lot confusing. It's probably one of the most complex issues we've really ever faced. It's going to be expensive, but it's got a potential to be curative. We don't have any of those short of transplant. And I assure you, transplant is not a cure. It's just a journey onto a different problem. Happy to have the problem. Thank you, Brandy. Happy to have the problem, but it's not an easy road either. Cure would be really great. Cure would be awesome. But when do you treat? Who do you treat? How do you treat? Does it last for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Do you need to redose? Do you become desensitized because you've already been exposed to the virus? There's so much we have to learn, but I'm hoping that our friends at Tenaya will give us some information in the next couple of weeks, months, about where they are with their first dosed patient and their second dose patient, and whether or not they've gone on to third dose patient yet. Things are evolving and moving quick. And I know BioMarin wants to come in the fall and start their trials. We're working up to this new day where for some, we're starting with myosin binding protein C. And then I got a snarky question the other day. Why is it starting with your gene, Lisa? I'm like, because I got the common one. And it's not going to do me any good, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't have that heart anymore. Others in my family may benefit, but my family will not be participating in any of the early clinical trials because the optics are not right, and it's not the right thing for them at this time. We're going to learn a lot more.
For your question, there is an answer. We started with that. Yes, it is the most common, but also it's a loss of function. And what the ADV9 does is it delivers, that shell delivers a gene. And so what you need is a loss of function mutation in order for that to be a viable mechanism for cure. Compare and contrast that with a gain of function mutation with MYH7. I could deliver another gene, but you still have the function of the other gene, the one that's inappropriately behaving, that's been turned on in an abnormal way. So what you actually have to do with them is knock that gene out. You have to take the gene that's misbehaving and remove it, rather than MYBPC3, where you have one that's not misbehaving as much as it's not doing anything. And so the second one, knocking a gene out, is a little more complicated. It's especially complicated when you wouldn't do it on a big scale versus replacement, which was a little bit more straightforward. When I say you can do it on a smaller scale, CRISPR-Cas9 is a technology that's literally like a highlighter that picks out the bad gene, snips it, and replaces it. And so I could go to, let's pretend, Lisa, you had MYH7 or I had MYH7 rather than the MYBPC3. We could go to you and say, let's, for Lisa, knock out her bad gene. But then I can't necessarily take that same platform and give it to everyone else. I would have to make a new drug for each person that I use this technology for. And so they're trying to think of creative ways that they could mass produce something rather than individually produce something. Because again, the hope is cure. You know, you hit on another really good question, though. Who do we give this to? There's almost two different questions. And these questions are so usually linked for doctors that it's unusual that we're having to unlink them. Who do we study it in and who do we use it in are actually different questions in this instance. Because I'd love to take somebody who was pre-phenotypic, who had no thickness, bad sounding family history, and treat them and say, you're never going to have anything that's abnormal. But to do a trial on that group of people, you got to follow them for 30 years to get enough events, to get enough bad things happening in the group that was placebo, in the group that didn't get anything, to show it worked.
Yeah, so that's not going to work.
So the trial is actually going to have to be performed on a group of people that have enough events in a short period of time in the placebo arm, the arm that didn't get anything, that you can show, look, when I didn't give it, here's how many events there were. When I did give it, here's how many events there were. This was better. And so for the first time, we're kind of wrestling with gene therapies about how do we structure these trials, right? We can't just take the neediest group or the group that you would clinically give it to, because God, we'd have to follow them for so long.
I've been in a lot of discussions about this very issue. I think we're all challenged with the fact that it is new. I think we thought we had more time. I think we thought we had another 8-10 years to figure it out. But technology popped. The mechanism is there to deliver. They have figured that part out. There's success in other disease states. The question is, can the heart muscle be a responder to this particular type of therapy? Hemophilia, different. It's blood. It's constantly producing. It's different. Sickle cell, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, Danon disease. There's a lot of gene therapy going on out there, and a couple of them have gotten approval, but the price tags are really high. But I remind everybody that when genetic testing came to us in 2005, it was $8,000 in 2005 for 3 to 5 genes. And now we can do it for $250 for a panel of, a couple hundred genes. So where we are now with price and scale, it's going to change. I will give a prediction as my final comment of this podcast, and Michael will be happy to have you back anytime. But in 10 years, I see a world where you would go to a gene therapy clinic and you would have your entire genetic profile evaluated so that if you have HCM and let's say a PCSK9 problem, so you're going to have hypercholesterolemia from some point, that we'd be able to mix the two and we can cure the HCM and maybe we can cure the PCSK9 pathway. And maybe there's something else that we find for some other genetic reason for AFib or something. And you'd get a little cocktail, you'd get an infusion and you'd go home. In 6 months, you'd go back and check in. I see that world happening. I see it happening. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be expensive, but long-term, you're paying for wellness, not sickness. We're giving health care, not illness care. We need to have a different shift in our philosophy. And we need to remember that food is medicine. And the stuff that's out there that we're eating, read your labels, people. Eat clean food. It doesn't help us. Those are my rants for the day on this Memorial Day weekend. I do have 2 announcements before we run away. Actually 3. Michael, you're invited back anytime you want to come back. Just let us know when you want to come back and talk. Sure. Would love to have the conversation continue. Number 2, it is Memorial Day, and a lot of people will wish you a happy Memorial Day. I will not. I will wish you a meaningful Memorial Day. This is our time to stop and think of those lost. It's not a party weekend. It's supposed to be a somber weekend. And for those of you who have family in the armed services, we thank you for their service. And for those who have lost loved ones in the armed services defending our country, we thank you and we remember you this weekend. And on the note of remembering, this week, I'm going to get emotional. This week, actually late last week, the HCM community lost a tremendous human being. His name was Dr. Aslan Turer, and he has been a previous guest on Tales from the Heart. Aslan was the co-director of the HCM program at UT Southwestern and a much loved member of our community. Aslan had been diagnosed with a rare form of lung cancer a number of years back and was actually very stable. I don't exactly know the method of death. I've been asked a lot of times, what happened? He went to work on Thursday and he died Thursday night. And he was well up until the time of his passing. His wife, Christy, and their 5 children will miss him deeply. For those of you who are in the HCM community, there is a post in the private group. If you would like to share your memory of your experience with Dr. Turer, I would encourage you to do so. We are going to create a scrapbook. His children are quite young. The youngest is about 5. So we're going to create a scrapbook of the memories from his patients. And we're going to give that to his wife so that as his children grow up and want to know another view of their father, they will have all of your memories in their hands. So please send us your memories. Please send us your thoughts on this wonderful man. Our condolences to his colleagues at UT Southwestern, Dr. Mark Link, and the rest of the team. They lost an amazing human being. We lost a friend. I co-wrote a couple of book chapters with him over the years as well. We will miss you, Aslan. Thank you for everything you did for our community. And I'm sorry you left so soon. He was 49 years old. So, not to take down the mood of this wonderful podcast, Michael, but we need to honor those who've helped us.
Important stuff.
It is rough stuff. Okay. We got a little bit long here today, but a great conversation. Michael, thank you for joining us. Everybody, thank you for joining. Thank you for joining Tales from the Heart. Thanks to all of our sponsors and to everybody out there with HCM who has not been seen by an HCMA recognized center of excellence yet. Please do so. It could change your life.
The Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association thanks the following sponsors for today's podcast: Cyokinetics, Bristol Myers Squibb, BioMarin, Tenaya Therapeutics, and Viz AI.